Hi, I wanted to share three common mistakes Microsoft 365 managers make today. Now, if you're an administrator, an IT pro, or just someone who owns Microsoft 365, I'm really hopeful that these will help you because for a lot of organizations, these are the most common and most sort of significant ones, and they're all pretty easy to resolve, right? Most of them just require a little bit of effort.
2Lead is a remote-first company based out of Canada.
What makes a world-class Microsoft 365 intranet and digital workplace?
So the first one that we run into a lot is we ask people, hey, are you sort of designed by default? Have you configured any of your Microsoft 365 services, or are they whatever the default settings, the sort of factory settings Microsoft provided were? And you'd be surprised at how many customers where the leader for Microsoft 365 management, the number one person for it, they'll say, yeah, we haven't really ever looked at those settings. We haven't really configured them. And so this is a big gap. Now, you may be really lucky and maybe some settings you configured, like Microsoft Teams. When you rolled out Microsoft Teams, you looked at things like policies and all the various things that you can configure for Teams. Great. But what about other technologies that are technically available to users, that are technically rolled out, but that you haven't done this due diligence on? As an example, maybe your Power Platform environment is live, enabling people to build Power Automates, Power Apps, etc. But that environment only has one environment. Literally, if you go to the Power Platform admin and we were to look at the settings, the default is one environment and you only have one. Well, that's a pretty big risk, pretty big gap, pretty big consideration where you should have at least multiple environments for various reasons, for DLP, for protection reasons, to enable you to actually administer, one environment where it's like sort of official apps and solutions within the organization that might have different support models, etc. So what's the biggest mistake we see? Well, it's people essentially taking the defaults or the factory settings for a lot of these services, enabling them, and not actually going through. And it's not a lot of effort. Just going through the admin experience alone would be really beneficial of going through those settings and seeing if, did we configure those the correct way? Do we understand what they are as well? Let's talk about number two, the second biggest mistake that we see a lot of organizations make. And this one is actually pretty straightforward. A lot of organizations don't know when we say, do you know what the productivity score is? Do you know what the security score is or the compliance score? They say, no, we don't know what those are. And so that's a shame because these are metrics and systems within Microsoft 365 that are actually meant to help you guide you towards using more of Microsoft 365 functionality and rolling it out in more effective ways. So if you take something like the productivity score, what it helps us understand is like, how are we communicating? Are we using multiple forms of communication? Meeting best practices, how many meeting best practices are we effectively meeting, or at least meeting one of those best practices today? Contribution levels to shared workspaces. We want people to actively collaborate and share their content and work in shared environments. You can literally have metrics today available that are really easy to consume that tell you those things. That's the productivity score if you've never heard of it. And if you look at things like security score or compliance score, those are also big risks, right? Things that we should be doing proactively, that we should be improving our posture, our organization. And most of them actually have very clear next steps. So it's a great way to consume and understand, what are the things we should be doing with Microsoft 365 more? Because when I see things like, we should be enabling MFA, for all of our end users, that's a pretty obvious one, but now you actually have the tools in those security scores to walk you through how to do that for your own organization. So a lot of these things are much more actionable, and Microsoft spent a lot of energy actually making these scores, I think, quite useful for organizations. So, if your organization's not using them, well, that's a pretty good example of another mistake that you might be making. A third one that we see, and probably the one of those ones that's most important in terms of long-term impact, is that a lot of organizations have not really thought about how Microsoft 365 works from a multi-cloud or connected cloud experience. So they think of, hey, we have this digital hub for our digital workplace, right? Our digital workplace technology or employee experience core technology is often Microsoft 365. But it's not the only technology you have. It's not the only system, app, or service that you're using. So if you're in that situation as an organization and you've never connected Microsoft 365, via search, via Teams, Power BI, you name it, if you haven't connected it or integrated it with other systems in your organization, then again, you're making a mistake because you're not taking full advantage of the capabilities that Microsoft 365 provides. Yes, it's a great integrated and self-contained ecosystem, but it's also one where you want to make sure it's connected to the apps and experiences that your own employees are using on a regular basis. So those are my three biggest mistakes that we see organizations make. Number one, they don't check the sort of default settings and they don't really explore those admin centers that are really easy to actually walk through yourself. Number two, a lot of organizations don't know what those scores are, productivity, security, and compliance, and then they don't act on them, which I think is another big mistake that organizations make today. And the third one that I've highlighted here is that a lot of organizations haven't connected their Microsoft 365 experience or systems and services with other applications and experiences that are important within their organization. And again, many of those connections can be done really easily, where it's a first-party connection Microsoft has made almost like a wizard, right, to configure and enable. So I would really suggest all three of these are relatively low effort to at least get further along than you are today. So if any of these resonated with you as mistakes, please take action as soon as you can. And if you have your own mistakes that we didn't cover here, or you have your own ideas that you want to share, let us know. What do you think are the biggest mistakes that organizations are making? And maybe we can help you kind of resolve maybe the mistakes that you feel might be happening within your own organization. We have an exciting webinar coming up around Microsoft 365 management mistakes. Now, why is this important? Well, because it's a really common challenge. When we were looking at the industry and we were looking for information on the kind of mistakes managers made, we were really sad to see that there wasn't that much insight. And so we thought we would spend a little bit of time, Christian Buckley and myself, another MVP, and a person who works at AvePoint, which is a leader in sort of Microsoft 365 management solutions. We thought we'd get together and really talk about what are some of the challenges that people run into and what are the mistakes that you can avoid, right, that others have made when they led the charge, right, on some of these things. So categories and areas of interest here would be things like keeping pace with Microsoft. The changes that Microsoft 365 provides are quite robust. So how do we tackle those? Industry and organizational changes. So mergers and acquisitions and things like that drive a lot of change as well. So we can talk about, how do we tackle those and what kind of mistakes do people make when they have a big event like that, or even, just restructuring challenges that happen, especially nowadays with the transition to hybrid and other work. How's that impacted Microsoft 365 management? Things around the top management mistakes that people make as well on not using tools, right, to offset or reduce the risk of these mistakes. These are all things that we'll talk about in great length. So really excited for the webinar. I hope you guys can come and join us. In the meantime, if you have your own questions around Microsoft 365 management, don't hesitate to reach out and share them.